Okay, it's time to talk about the chemical compounds found in living things. So, the human body is made up of a vast array of chemical compounds that are based on carbon. The carbon's there as the backbone of the chemical. Nitrogen is there somewhat as the backbone, but oxygen and hydrogen are peripheral. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen atoms make up 96.3% of our body mass. So, most of our body mass is made up of stuff that is actually not that common in the Earth's crust. Organic compounds, by definition, are any compounds that contain carbon. Inorganic compounds, by definition, are things that do not contain carbon. The only exception to that is carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide are technically considered inorganic. Organic chemistry doesn't deal with those two things because they don't form molecules found in living things, or they don't make complex structures. So, in the human body, we find carbon compounds that fall into one of four categories. They're either carbohydrates, they're lipids, they're nucleic acids, or they're proteins. And there are a few other obscure things such as vitamins, but we won't be talking about those right now. The inorganic compounds that make up the human body are things like salts, minerals, and carbon dioxide, oxygen gas, nitrogen gas. Those are inorganic. Now, organic compounds. Carbon's a weird atom because it can form four strong covalent bonds all at the same time. So this is a diagram kind of demonstrating that. This carbon atom can bind to four different hydrogen atoms at once. That's the structure of methane gas, which is what heats our houses. This is diamond and this is graphite. This is carbon forming four covalent bonds three-dimensionally. This is carbon forming four covalent bonds with other carbon atoms in sheets only. This can be turned into this with high heat and pressure. You can actually take a machine and turn this into this. We call that zirconium diamond. It's not worth as much as natural diamond because it has bubbles in it. There's no way to keep the bubbles out of it. It has impurities in it. But it's used to make abrasives, like for sandpaper and stuff. So, carbon is capable of forming molecules, and then those molecules are capable of bonding to themselves and making even bigger molecules, like supermolecules. We call this polymerization. Polymerization is the forming of super large molecules from joining together a bunch of smaller molecules. The smaller molecules are called monomers, and the monomers join together to form polymers by a process called polymerization. The human body is in the business of polymerization. You are constantly building carbohydrate, lipid, protein, and nucleic acid molecules in your body to keep your body built up because you're constantly breaking down. So you need to constantly build up to keep up with the breakdown process. Now, the very first compound we're going to talk about is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, and sometimes a few others, but the hallmark is CH&O, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. But the H to O ratio in a carbohydrate is 2 to 1. And that's what carbohydrate kind of means. Carbohydrate means carbon water. And water has a 2 to 1 ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. And that's what carbohydrates have, a hydrogen oxygen ratio of 2 to 1. Carbohydrates are primarily used by the human body for energy, either immediate energy or for energy storage. Or where they're also used as cement to hold ourselves together. We use a collagen, but collagen contains hyaluronan, which is collagen has other carbohydrates in it that help to form a glue to hold your tendons and your ligaments and your muscles together. So carbohydrates in general, because they can hydrogen bond, are extremely soluble in water. They have what are called hydroxyl groups sticking out of them that make them hydrogen bond with water. The most common carbohydrates fall into three categories. They're either monosaccharides, which are simple sugars, they're disaccharides, which are double sugars, or they're polysaccharides, which are multi-sugars. The monosaccharides, which are also known as simple sugars, come in three basic flavors. The most common three are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Each of these three compounds has a formula of C6H12O6, but they're each geometrically shaped differently. And so they all three have different tastes in your mouth and they have different uses in the body. Glucose is the most common of the three. It's your immediate cellular fuel. It's cracked in half and used by your mitochondria, which are your little powerhouses, and they release the energy stored in there, and then they send that energy to other organelles in your cells to keep you running. Glucose and fructose are isomers of glucose, and they have the same basic formula, but they taste differently. And they have some obscure uses. Fructose is used in plants to make fruits taste good. Fructose is present in some body fluids at low quantity. And galactose is also the third one, which is not mentioned much here, it's kind of a rare monosaccharide. It's not present in high quantities much anywhere, but it is also a simple sugar, and it does store some energy. All right. One of the wonderful things about monosaccharides is that they are incredibly soluble in water, and they have no effect on the pH of the water they dissolve in. So you can dump massive amounts of sugar into water to make Kool-Aid, and the water tastes great. When you make water acidic, it tastes really sour. And when you make water taste basic, very basic, it tastes bitter. And so sour and bitter things can be pretty horrible. But when you dump lots of sugar in water, you only get sweet. There's no pH change. That's not true for a lot of other foods, but it is true for sugars. The disaccharides, the double sugars, include sucrose, maltose, and lactose. They're about twice the size of a monosaccharide. And the most common of these three is sucrose. Disaccharides are commonly used by plants to transport sugar, and that would be sucrose and maltose. Mammals use lactose to feed their young. So here's sucrose. It's two monosaccharides bonded together. Here's another way to look at it. This is looking at it sort of three-dimensionally. This is looking at it just two-dimensionally, top down. And this is how your body takes lactose apart. When you put lactose in your digestive tract, you basically crack the two monosaccharides. This is a monosaccharide, this is a monosaccharide. You have special chemicals in your digestive tract called enzymes that chop that bond open and release each of the monosaccharides, which you then absorb into your body. So monosaccharides, going back, are just simple sugar rings of carbon and oxygen. Okay, galactose, fructose, glucose. These are two different ways to draw glucose. They are rings of carbon, usually with a little oxygen atom stuck in there. There's an oxygen atom there, there's one there. This right here is showing the conversion of linear glucose, which is what glucose is when it's dry, into hex glucose, which is what happens to it when you drop it in water. It forms a ring. So the disaccharides are made of two monosaccharides stuck together. The polysaccharides are made of many monosaccharides stuck together. Starch, for example, is one of the common polysaccharides. It's made of multiple monosaccharides stuck together. And so this is how we would draw it schematically, just showing glucose, 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 glucose. Okay. Cellulose is actually multiple monosaccharides stuck together. Cellulose is what is in wood and plant fiber. It's in fiber that you're supposed to get in your diet. It's not digestible by you. It makes up the cotton in your clothing. Cellulose is not digestible by you because the sugar molecules are bonded in unusual ways, and your enzymes in your digestive tract can't cut them apart. Now, if a goat actually eats a piece of your clothing, it can digest your clothing, at least the cotton, because it has bacteria in its digestive tract that release digestive enzymes that break down the cellulose. You don't have those bacteria, so you don't get that benefit. The next group now, lipids. Lipids are fatty molecules. They contain, like carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but their H to O ratio is far, far greater than 2:1. Lipids are waxy and oily as they feel between your fingers. They're used to insulate and store energy. When whales are described as having a layer of blubber, the blubber is what makes it possible for a whale, which has a body temperature higher than the human body, to swim in the Arctic Sea and actually potentially overheat. Whereas the human in the same sea with only a few millimeters of fat dies within 2 minutes. Lipids sometimes are used for cell-to-cell communication in the form of hormones, and lipids also make up the base material of the cell membranes of all our cells. But we'll talk more about that later in the next unit. Typical waxes, which are a type of lipid, are used to repel water and they're used by, like, in your ears. Earwax keeps water from sitting in your ear. And in plants, wax coats the leaves and keeps water from the outside from getting in and water from the inside from getting out. Lipids are generally nonpolar, and they have no hydrogen bonding sites, and that's why they don't like to hang out with water. So that's why water beads up when you put it on a wax. Now, these are different drawings of the atomic structure of waxes. This is a fatty acid. This is 3 fatty acids stuck together by a glycerol bridge here, and this is called a triglyceride. This is an unusual lipid. It is a phospholipid because it's got phosphate here and 2 fatty acid tails stuck together. This is what makes up your cell membranes. And then this right here is cholesterol, which is famously in things like eggs that supposedly contributes to heart attacks. It's a little different in structure than the other 3 lipids that are shown here, which are made from fatty acids, but cholesterol is still a lipid. So the basic lipids that we get in our diet are triglycerides. Triglycerides look like this or this, depending on how you draw them. They are basically fatty acids that are stuck together to a glycerol backbone. They're used for energy storage in animals and for insulation. They have lots of hydrogen bonded to carbon. And if they're saturated, they have the maximum amount of hydrogen. If they're not saturated, they got some double bonds in the fatty acids, and so they're missing some hydrogen because of the double bonds, and we call that unsaturated. Generally speaking, unsaturated fats are often actually liquids at room temp, and we call them oils. Saturated fats are generally solid at room temp. We call those fats traditionally. So there's an example of linoleic acid. That's a fatty acid that is not straight because it's got a double bond in here and it's got a kink in it. This is a fatty acid. This is palmitate, and it doesn't have any double bonds, so it's straight. This one right here, which is oleate, has 1 double bond, which actually bends it there, although they didn't draw it bent. So what other kinds of lipids are there? Well, there's sterols and phospholipids. These are sterols. Sterols include things like cholesterol, estrogen, and testosterone. These chemicals are chemical messengers that carry information around your body. You may have heard of steroids and steroid abuse by athletes. That's basically testosterone, which helps to build muscle. It's a messenger that tells your muscles to build themselves up. There are also phospholipids, which are lipids, and they form the backbone of the membrane chemistry you have that's around your cells. This is a cell membrane here, and each one of these little blue objects with tails is a single phospholipid. So the phospholipids make up 2 layers that make up the structure of your cell membrane. So phospholipids are peculiar in that the phosphates are polar and the rest of the molecules nonpolar, and that's why it forms these double layers. But we'll talk more about that later. Nucleic acids, which we're going to talk about in a later chapter, are your biggest molecules. They store your hereditary information. And unlike the previous groups, they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and nitrogen, and phosphorus. And as a result of that, they're chemically distinct from the carbohydrates and the lipids. There are 2 types of nucleic acid typically in your cells. There are DNA and RNA. And the DNA is generally for long-term storage of hereditary information. That's what you inherited from your parents that made you who you are. RNA is temporary, and it's what your DNA manufactures as it dictates what proteins you produce. And it's the proteins that you actually make that determines your physical features. The last group of the biochemicals we're going to talk about are the proteins. And unlike the previous groups, proteins contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, like the lipids and the carbohydrates, but they have nitrogen, like the nucleic acids, but they don't have any phosphorus. Some proteins have sulfur in them because one of the building blocks, or 2 of the building blocks, actually have sulfur in them. Proteins are made of monomers called amino acids. And there are 20 different amino acids. And so there are just gazillions of different kinds of protein molecules in the animal and the plant and the fungi and the protist kingdoms. And that's because of all the different proteins that different organisms make, which make them all different from one another. Some examples of typical proteins that are found in the human body are things like hemoglobin, collagen, insulin, growth hormone, which is also called HGH, keratin, which makes up the structure of your hair, etc., etc. This diagram is showing all the different amino acids and what they have in common. There are 20 different amino acids. All 20 of them are pictured here. What they all have in common is this NCC, which you see right here. N, here's the N, here's the C, and there's the C. There's the N, there's the C, there's the C. NCC, NCC, there's a C there. The artist just hasn't drawn the C's at all the angles here, but this is NCC. Here is the NCC, NCC, NCC. And then they all have extra goofy atoms sticking off, and that's what makes all the amino acids different from one another. Each amino acid has an amino group and a carboxyl group. The amino group is the NH2 group, and the carboxyl group is the COOH group. This is an amino acid. Here's the NH2 group. Here's the COOH group. Each amino acid differs by what's attached right here to the central carbon. That's called the R group. Now, if two amino acids join together, you get a dipeptide. This is called a dipeptide. Here's one amino acid. There's another amino acid. The two together make up a dipeptide. Here's another way of drawing the same basic dipeptide. Now, when you get many amino acids joined together, okay, like you got here in this picture, then you get a polypeptide. Polypeptides are what make up proteins, and proteins are what make the human body work. So it's true that you inherited DNA or nucleic acid from your parents, which make you who you are. But really what makes your hair have the texture it has, and your skin have the color it does, and your skin have the texture it does, and your muscles have the contractibility they have, is the proteins that you're making. Your DNA that your parents gave you dictate the protein production that your body is performing right now. So that completes the biochemistry portion of this chapter. Next, I'm going to move into chemical reactions.